And a pleasant good afternoon to everyone out there in Irish Breakdown Land. I am Vince D'Addario. That is Ryan Roberts. And we are in here today to talk about the Notre Dame schedule. Brian and I kicked things off last week. We talked about teams. We ranked the schedule. We talked about teams 12 through 7. And today, Ryan's going to pick up the baton for Brian. And we are going to go teams 6 through 1. And we're going to talk about all about these teams. And again, we're not going to go, super in depth on each team, but just kind of the strengths, the weaknesses, things like that. And then, of course, we will do individual previews of each team as we get closer to the season and all that. But this is fun. This is going to be a lot of fun, Ryan. I'm really pumped to get into it. But before we do, there is a little bit, I wouldn't call it breaking news. I would call it news. And it has Notre Dame Nation all abuzz and all of Twitter about, should Notre Dame do this? Should Notre Dame do that? We know Notre Dame is in the market for a 23 quarterback. There was a quarterback that decommitted from an ACC school, Florida State. I've seen it in multiple different areas. Should we go after this guy? He looks like a dude, et cetera, et cetera. Ryan, your opinion on this young man, number one, and then number two, whether he is a fit at Notre Dame and whether they're going after him.
Yeah, we talked about it a ton yesterday on the show, right? Because it was a quarterback-driven conversation. I do like Chris Parson. He's kind of a player that lives outside of structure. He's like one of those dudes, Vince, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. When you're a defensive coach and you have a quarterback hemmed in, and then he just keeps evading pressure and keeps extending the play. He's
so frustrating. It's so frustrating.
Because you have gap integ, you have your pass rush integrity, right? You have your lanes, and he's dead to rights, and he still somehow magically gets out of the way and makes a play. And that's what Chris Parson is. He's not a dynamic runner, but he's a dynamic extender, good player, just overall. So I do like Chris Parson. And in the show yesterday, I said, if I was Notre Dame, I'd make the call and just see what's up. Are you at that time, he wasn't yet decommitted from Florida State, but we had heard rumblings that was coming soon. From everything I'm hearing, though, I don't think Notre Dame's going to get into the fray with it. I don't think that it's a good fit just from both sides. I don't think it's a move that they're going to make. We've talked a lot about this, and that's why we did the show yesterday. Austin Novosad and Kenny Minchie, I think, are the two targets for Notre Dame that they are really focused in on and they're lasered in on. And I think that those are going to be the guys that, if they're able to flip either one of them, because Novosad is obviously committed to Baylor, Minch is committed to Pittsburgh, so you're going to have to flip someone. I think that they have kind of zeroed in on those two players, though. So I would not expect them to get into the race for Chris Parson. It's definitely a conversation because I do think he's a talented football player and he's now on the market. But I ultimately think that they have their eyes set on Austin Novosad or Kenny Minchie if they can get one of those players to flip.
And it's not exactly crunch time per se, but the two guys that they're going after are both committed someplace else. So they kind of got to make their play. Excuse me. They got to make their play now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, they do. Because, the thing is, Vince, especially with Austin Novosad, because he's been a guy that's been perceived as flippable for a little bit, right? So, but he's talked to us, and John Garcia talked about it yesterday from SI All-American, that Austin wanted to try to get things figured out this month, though. If he's going to flip, he wants to do it now, and he wants to shut things down because he's one of those kids that, he wants to get this finished before his senior season starts, right?
Smart.
He doesn't
I
want
like
this
that.
dwelling. Yeah, exactly. Dwelling into the fall, and it is a very distracting thing. And it's a nuanced thing, but it's hectic this time of year for high school recruits. So it sounds like that could be extended a little bit because he has Ohio State coming after him. He's got Notre Dame now coming after him. He's got Texas A&M coming after him. So a lot of really high caliber programs are coming out after Austin Novosad.
Right.
Nobody's talked really about Kenny Minchie, how flippable he is. We've talked about that yesterday a little bit. I think it's possible because I do think that there is interest from both sides, obviously. So we're going to see if he's willing to get out of the pick commitment or if he's willing to, kind of at least listen to Notre Dame's pitch in that long term. And we've already seen the We've already seen the offer extended to Austin Novosad. We're expecting the offer to Kenny Minchie to come very soon here. So I think that those are the two pulls. And I mean, to your point, most players want to get this over with by the start of their senior season. So like after the Dante thing kind of dwelled on for a while, Notre Dame doesn't need to kick this up because they're pretty much starting. They did recruit Kenny Minchie at one point a little bit, never offered him. So they have some work that they've already put in on that regard. But Austin Novosad's a completely new guy to this board. So they're going to have to try to put in work very quickly on a guy they haven't had deep conversations with to this point.
Okay. So that's where everything stands with the 23 quarterback scenarios with Notre Dame, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun kind of down the stretch and see where this thing goes. I mean, it's open again, and we've got people in both corners. I think there's the Minchie corner, there's the Novosad corner, there's the hey, let's keep an eye on every other quarterback that exists with 23 after their name corner as well. And we saw a little bit of that when this kid decommitted from Florida State. So thanks for filling us in. Appreciate that.
Well, and I'll say this too, Vince, before we jump completely in. It's a really good quarterback class. So fortunately,
yes,
depending on what corner you're in, you're probably rooting for a good football player. So it's not a bad situation to be.
That's a good call. Bad situation to be. I've seen a lot of people out there, hey, Notre Dame can't be picky. They got to take what they can get. Beggars can't be choosers, like that kind of stuff. And it's like, that's not the case that Notre Dame is sitting in right now because of the depth of this class. And
100%.
Yes, they went all in on Dante Moore for all the reasons that were outlined, over the past few days. I understand it. I get it. But they had kind of a soft landing on that whole thing because of how deep the 23 class is. And so they're going to end up with a really good quarterback, no matter who it is. If it's Novosad, if it's Minchie, if it's some other guy that we haven't talked about, they're going to end up with a good kid. I mean, these are 4-star, caliber type kids, if I'm not mistaken. So I know that's more your territory than it is mine, but I've watched their film. Both these boys can play.
100%. Now they're both 200 caliber players, in my opinion. I know Brian kind of shares a similar sentiment. I think there's a conversation over, which ones. I think we just had a question that we'll kind of hit during the mailbag section of this show, but there's going to be some, push one way or the other because they're very different players, right? So like it's examining the fit. It's kind of understanding what's the ceiling, what's the floor, and really understanding like which one fits best into what the current quarterback room is. So it's a fascinating conversation.
It is a fascinating conversation, and I look forward to continuing to have it over the next few weeks. And because look, high school football season is literally right around the corner. It is about 3 weeks away, frankly, at least in Indiana. August 1st is day one. So these guys are going to want to have some stuff figured out, I would imagine, before they start things off. So this thing could come to a head here pretty quickly. So I'm excited about that. We will have a mailbag, as Ryan said earlier. We're going to get through our second half of the ranking of the schedule, and then we will have a mailbag. So if you want to hold off on your questions until towards the end, then you can start throwing them in. If we see some questions, we'll star them. We'll put them in there. There's some good conversation going on in the chat, as there always is. But we're going to focus now on the top half of the Notre Dame 2022 schedule, where we see these teams falling. Just as a recap for our friends out there, the bottom half, we had UNLV 12, we had Navy 11, we had Cal as number 10, Marshall was number 9, Stanford was 8, and Syracuse was 7. So those were the bottom 6. And so now we're going to jump into the top half, and let's kick it off from our boys on Tobacco Road. From North Carolina, Notre Dame is going to make that trip down to North Carolina. It's an interesting part of the schedule, frankly. And I think that kind of has a little bit of something to do with where this team is located, or ranked, I should say. But our 6th place team is the North Carolina Tar Heels. Ryan, your thoughts on North Carolina coming into this season having to replace an NFL drafted quarterback?
Yeah, I think, Vince, you hit the nail on the head with it's an interesting part of the schedule because obviously starting out with Ohio State, you have a couple Marshall, Cal, not the hardest games on your schedule. And then you kind of hit a little bit of a nice little uptick as far as the caliber of teams that you're going to play. And North Carolina's sandwiched right between Cal and in front of BYU. And we're expecting BYU to be a pretty physical football game, right? So North Carolina, I think, brings a completely different style from the teams that are kind of around them in the schedule, which can make it tough at times, right? Like you're preparing for a team that is very different than what's around the remaining schedule. So you're preparing for something that's completely different from a stylistic perspective. But to your point, last year you're losing Sam Howell, who got drafted in the 5th round by the Washington Commanders.
The Commanders.
But I would argue, Vincent, I don't know if you agree with this. I think, and this is all respect to Sam Howell, because he had a great game against Notre Dame last year. There's no doubt about it.
I mean, he was a one-man show, let's be honest. I mean, he was we just talked about quarterbacks that play, what was the word that you used? Outside the system or whatever the term you use.
Out of structure.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
That was him. I mean, that was his whole game in that particular game, and it gave Notre Dame fits, absolute fits.
Sure did.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we're evaluating just the fact that, hey, you're losing Howell, who was a great player for North Carolina for a few years and had a great game against Notre Dame, it's obviously going to be different. Whether that is Jacoby Griswold or if it's Drake May, I think is in the conversation with Criswell. I keep saying the wrong word. Jacoby Criswell or it's Drake May as the starting quarterback. It's going to look a lot different, but I don't think difference necessarily a bad thing, because I think one thing about Sam Howell last year is the highs were always high, right? He had a great game against Notre Dame, but I do think as a whole season perspective, he pressed a little bit, and I think there was times where he tried to do a little bit too much. And North Carolina is going to be replacing a lot of offensive linemen, Jordan Tucker and Marcus McKeithen and Joshua Zuna. They're all gone from the team. But sometimes addition by subtraction is a good thing, right? Because the offensive line was not good, especially for North Carolina. But what I do know they're going to have is the guy that gave them the most fits last year was Josh Downs, who is a dynamic wide receiver. So it's a funky game for me because I don't really know what to expect offensively. I know what system they're going to run. They're not going to change their system. They're still going to run the Phil Longo spread, their air raid system. Sure. But without Sam Howell pressing as much, without being a one-man show, is it a more balanced attack? Do we get kind of the both sides? Is the running game more of an implementation? Are they going to use Josh Downs in different ways? Because I could see him doing some jets, doing end arounds, working from the slot, working a little bit outside.
Sure.
So I think that's an interesting game because there's a lot of differences from the North Carolina teams we saw last year, and there are some athletes. There was absolutely some athletes on this offense, especially.
Well, and also obviously bringing in a new defensive coordinator. That's going to be an interesting, because we all know the defense wasn't very good at North Carolina. They got a bunch of returners.
Addition by subtraction.
There you go. They got a bunch of returning starters on defense, but it's going to be a different scheme. Offensively, they've only got 4 returning starters, and that is going to be and one on the offensive line, as you had mentioned. So, what's that going to look like? I have too many questions about North Carolina to put them higher on the list. And frankly, there was a bit of a debate between Brian and I as to where we were going to put North Carolina and BC. Kind of okay, which one do you put higher? And quite simply, I said BC should be higher because they have an established quarterback. And
it's fair.
I like what they have offensively. I like where they were going when they had a healthy quarterback, et cetera. And we'll get to them in a minute. But North Carolina has those question marks right now where BC does not. So that was my big thing as to why I put North Carolina at 6 and then BC a little higher.
I know I talked a lot about the offense, obviously, in the introduction, but I mean, they have some guys. Like I mentioned, Josh Downs a little bit as a guy that I think is one of the better wide receivers that they're going to see. I think for me, Vince, too, what I want to mention is you mentioned Jay Bateman's obviously out as the defensive coordinator. They have a new defensive coordinator coming in.
Gene Chizik.
I think that there's a lot.
So Gene
Chizik. I think, it's a great name. I mean, Gene Chizik has historically been a good defensive coach. So, I think that he's going to do good in that department. My point, though, I was, trying to get to, but I kind of ramble at some points. But North Carolina has more talent defensively than I think was able to be shown by Jay Bateman. Because I think that you have Tony Grimes at corner, who I think is going to break out this year. I think he's going to be a great player as a junior. Miles Murphy's a really talented defensive lineman there. They have Raymond Voracek coming back, who's been a very solid player. And they have Noah Taylor transferring in, who's kind of like the rush linebacker for Virginia. So I think there's some talent on North Carolina defensively. So if North Carolina takes a step defensively and they get a little more balanced offensively without playing so much hero ball, they could be a tough out. I'm not saying, obviously Notre Dame should win that football game. There's no doubt about it. But I do think that North Carolina presents they're a very interesting matchup, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think they are a very interesting matchup because of all the question marks. It makes it more interesting to me, right? Because you mentioned it. They've got a lot of guys coming back defensively who could be good. It's like they were not good because of the scheme. Maybe now that they can be good in a different scheme, et cetera, that remains to be seen. I don't know. And so it's going to be interesting to see what this team brings to the table, as far as, this team could be better than, how do I want to say this? I almost feel like their record could be better than the team could be as well. Looking at their schedule, I mean, the schedule is not exactly daunting. Now, granted, it's the ACC. So the ACC is not all that daunting. That's understood. But, they should be 3-0 going into the Notre Dame game. I mean, they open up with Florida A&M, Appalachian State, and Georgia State. I mean, good grief. How could you not be 3-0 going into the Notre Dame game? And then, of course, they welcome Notre Dame to North Carolina. So that's their second home game of the year. But then the rest of their schedule, I mean, they've got Virginia Tech, Miami, Duke, Pittsburgh, Virginia, Wake Forest, Georgia Tech, and NC State. I mean, not exactly murderer's row. NC State, I think, is the best team in North Carolina right now. So that's their last game. That's their rivalry game. It's a big game for them. But other than that, I mean, Miami's doing a great job on the recruiting trail, but they're not there yet, right? And, I don't know. I'm not that impressed with their schedule. So they could be a 10-2 football team pretty easily, I think.
I think they're a volatile team too, right? Because we're going to talk about USC during this segment as well. And it's like, USC, I have no idea exactly what they're going to be. I think they're going to be an 8-4, 9-3 type of team. But could they be 10-2? Sure. Could they be 6-6 in their first year under Lincoln Riley? Also sure. I also think that this team, though, I think North Carolina's a little bit volatile too. If you told me they're 6-6 this year, I'd be like, yeah, okay. If you told me, I think Archer said something about it in the chat. If they're 9-3, I'd be like, also okay. I could see that happening, right? So there's a lot of different outcomes for this North Carolina team, which I think makes it pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's North Carolina. They are our number 6 team in this ranking. I kind of alluded to it already between North Carolina and Boston College. We placed Boston College in the 5th slot for numerous reasons. I personally think that they're more of a complete team going into the season, which I think is going to, benefit them. I mean, they open up. They don't open up with the 3-game slate that North Carolina opens up with. They've actually got a little bit of, they got Rutgers and then Virginia Tech. Their second game of the season is a conference game, right? So I just feel like they're more complete, especially offensively. They've got more returning starters. Now, granted, they are replacing almost their entire offensive line, which is, when you've got a good quarterback, that's great. But you need to get that sorted out. But I have faith in what Boston College can do there. But I don't know. I just feel like they're more of a complete team, Ryan. What say you about Boston College?
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting conversation between North Carolina and Boston College, which you alluded to when you kind of intro North Carolina a little bit. I think the difference, to your point, is Boston College has a good quarterback. This one's a little different, though, for me, Vince. I would have been much more okay with this ranking if, Christian Mahogany just got hurt for them, right? Who's their lone returning starter. I mean, I know that.
You're right.
I know that they had Jack Conley that started a couple games last year while what's his name, Vrabel was hurt or whatever. But I mean, they are breaking in literally 5 new starters on the offensive line. They have Zay Flowers coming back, who's a really dynamic wide receiver. Jalen Gill is a good football player, and that Pat Garwo kid, the running back, I just watched a little bit of him yesterday. That kid's a tough little bowling ball, man. He's not a dynamic player, but breaks a lot of tackles. He's got kind of that short strider feel to him, but he's a tough little football player, man. So I think they should be able to run the football pretty well as long as the offensive line is decent enough. They'll have George Takis that's going to be playing some tight end for them as well. I know their other tight end, Joey Lucchetti, is not a bad football player as well. So I think as long as Phil is healthy coming into this game, I think that he presents a big challenge for you, especially when he should have a running game behind him. My biggest question is, I don't know what to expect from that defense. I know their secondary is pretty good. I mean, they got Josh DeBerry coming back, who's a pretty good football player. I know Elijah Jones has been a solid player. Jaden Woodby's kind of playing that safety linebacker hybrid role. So I think the secondary should be pretty good. But the rest of the defense, I don't think is great. But I mean, ultimately, I think it's all going to be about just how explosive this team and how consistent they can be running the football offensively. Because I think that's what presents the most challenges, in my opinion.
Well, and with the type of offense that they run, if you don't have a running game, you're in trouble. I mean, they do a lot of play action. They like to get Phil out of the pocket. They don't want him just to stand, because that's not his game anyway, right? And what I will say is, Jeff Hafley has done a really good job of calling plays and making his offense about Phil Dracovic. And I think that's what Notre Dame failed to do because they didn't have him in the starting lineup, obviously. They didn't play to his strengths, okay? I'll say that. I think Phil Hafley's done a really good job of that. And Jeff Hafley. I think I said Phil for some reason. I said Phil Dracovic.
Phil Dracovic.
Right. But I do think he's done a very good job of that. He lets Phil kind of do his thing, and that benefits this offense. Having Zay Flowers back, I think, is huge too, because I believe he had a decision to make about going to the NFL or coming back to school, and he chose to come back to school. And that is massive because that is obviously Phil's deep threat, and Phil has a beautiful deep ball. Always has, always will. And I think this offense can be scary, dangerous, but you're right. They need to have a run game. If they don't have a run game, this offense isn't going to go anywhere. You can't put everything on the shoulders and the legs and the arm of Phil Dracovic. That's not going to work. He's going to need help. And if that offensive line isn't at the very least salvageable, then they're going to struggle offensively. So that's a really good point that you made, Ryan, about the run game. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, well, I think that Garwo kid is maybe the most underrated running back in the ACC, maybe one of the most underrated in the country. He quietly had 1,000 yards last year, despite the fact that for the majority of the season, Phil Dracovic was out with an injury, right? They had their backup quarterback playing, and they were still successful. Obviously, they had a good offensive line, a very veteran offensive line, so that helps everything. But
sure.
I mean, the kid had a really nice season. So I think if they're able to run the football against Notre Dame, then that's going to present some opportunities. Because I think, to your point, Vince, they have a couple weapons out wide. Zay Flowers is a good football player. And if they're able to get a good running game, I mean, fill off a play action, just be able to kind of stretch the field vertically. I think that's where it gets a little interesting for me if you're Notre Dame, and how you're going to defend the play action game if they're able to establish a running game early.
Absolutely. And then, of course, just to throw some interest into this game, it's the last home game of the season for Notre Dame. It's senior day. Phil's coming back. All of these different things.
Right before USC as well.
Yeah. This is a classic trap game, frankly, where it falls on the schedule. I mean, you're coming off of Navy. That's not obviously, but you're also coming off of Clemson. So it's Clemson, Navy, Boston College, Southern Cal. If Notre Dame is where they should be record-wise going into this game, there's a lot of people, not necessarily saying the team, but there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be looking past Boston College to Southern Cal and what they bring to the table if they're having a good season. I mean, that could be a huge matchup at the end of the season, depending on how USC is, depending on where Notre Dame is. People are going to be looking past Boston College. I could definitely see that. Now, I don't think that happens inside the Goog, but I think, people that we associate with and fans, they could be looking past this game. And I think that is like the definition of a trap game.
And also, I think we talked about this before. You have Navy the week before, triple option team. You have USC the week after. It's going to be an air raid team. And then you're facing a pro style team right in the middle, right? That's just, you're working against 3 different schemes in 3 different weeks. So it's kind of a weird preparation basis, right? So I think that's another thing where it could fit into a trap game, because I don't think Notre Dame has to get up to play against Boston College, because that's they're kind of looked at as the little brother to Notre Dame.
Yes.
So they want to continue to make them look like the little brother to Notre Dame. But the fact that you're playing a triple option team right into Boston College, then also have to start preparing for an air raid team the week after, I think that's where it gets a little funky for Al Golden, obviously, down the stretch of the season.
Absolutely. No question about it. So I think BC is going to be, I think you could easily put this game a little bit higher, not only because of who the team is, but where it falls on the schedule. Mm-hmm. But we have them at 5, and I think that's a pretty solid place considering the 4 teams that are above them.
Agree.
Let's move on to the next one. And you mentioned it in the last sentence, and that's why this we don't have Brian here to be the master of segue. We've got Ryan, the master of segue. Our number 4 team are the USC Trojans, Southern Cal, last game of the season on the road. This one's tough for me because, again, I think I could have flip-flopped 3 and 4 potentially, but the question marks abound for USC. So I think it's a very similar argument for me as to why I had BC above North Carolina, which is also, I think, why I have USC where I have them, because they have so many questions. They got skill players coming out the wazoo. They got a brand new coaching staff, a lot of new happening at USC. It's almost a complete roster turnover. But who are they going to be? And they're playing in the Pac-12. What kind of competition is going to be there? I think they could almost sleepwalk into an 8-win season. You know what I mean? And how are they going to look doing it? Where are they going to be in, this game by the time the Notre Dame gets to them in their 12th game? There's a lot of question marks here.
There is a whole lot of question marks. I think that what's going into USC's advantage is that it's the last game of the season, right? So like they should have a lot of those transitional things kind of figured out at that point, right? Like guys should guys should definitely be fitted into their role, and they should be comfortable with what their role is on the team. So that one shouldn't be too much of a concern. And also it could be a massive game, Vince, because I mean, like you said, these two teams could have really good records coming in this week. So this could be almost a play-in game, maybe. I mean, we'll see what happens with Notre Dame, but if Notre Dame goes into this week and they're 10-1 or 11-0, like obviously this game is of massive importance. I don't know what to expect from USC. I'll be very honest. Like they have a lot of names. There's a whole lot of names. Caleb Williams is a really talented football player, obviously transferring over from Oklahoma. Travis Dye was a 1,000-yard rusher for Oregon last year. Good football player. You have the Bolitnikoff Award winner and Jordan Addison coming over from Pitt. You have Mario Williams, another talented receiver coming from Oklahoma. You have Brandon Rice, the son of Jerry Rice, transferring over from Colorado, who I think is a good football player that was just very much underutilized. Yeah. You have Garrett Bryant coming back at wide receiver. You have Terrell Bynum transferring in. I mean, the skill position is going to be really good at USC. It's dynamic. It's a lot of playmakers. You only have one football to throw around, but wherever that football is going, you're going to get into the hands of a really talented football player. I mean, I didn't even mention Malcolm Epps, who's like a pretty talented kind of like slot tight end hybrid, right? Like the talented receivers and running backs in this situation. So there's going to be a lot of options. They even had Austin Jones, who transferred in from Stanford as well, who's a decent running back who's going to kind of back up guys. So there's a lot of options, Vince. My biggest question is offensive line. Last year was bad. Like it wasn't like meh. It wasn't okay. It wasn't average. It was bad.
No, it was bad.
It wasn't a great team.
Right.
And you have your best one coming back. I mean, Andrew Voorhees was a pretty good guard for them last year. And you have Brett Nalen, who is a solid starting center. But outside of that, man, like you don't have a lot returning as far as starting options. And I mean, I just don't know what to expect from this offensive line. I don't expect it to be a great unit. And then that defense, again, they got a lot of names. I mean, Shane Lee transfers in from Alabama. You have Mekhi Blackman transferring in. Latrell McCutcheon was a cornerback, a high recruited kid that was at Oklahoma that's transferring in. You have names there. But last year wasn't good, and I don't know if you have. I think you're transferring in a couple good players, but I don't know if there's many difference makers that transferred in to USC. So I don't think their defense is going to be very good. I think their offensive line is going to be kind of bad, to be honest. I don't know if it'll be much better than last year, if I'm being completely honest with you. The wide receivers and the running backs will be dynamic, so I think they're going to be able to score some points. But are they going to be able to stop a team like a Notre Dame that we think that their offense is going to be really good, or just in general? So I think where you win football games is, of course, you need good quarterback play. You need to score points. But at the end of the day, if you can't protect your quarterback and you can't get any push up front and you can't play defense, you're not going to win a ton of football games. So, so they might win some games because they're in a depleted Pac-12. But when you're playing against a good football team, in theory, I just don't know what the end result's going to be. So I don't have big expectations for USC as far as being a legit team. Good team, not legit team though.
Yeah, I think they'll win games just based on their talent alone, right? From their skill talent. I mean, especially conference games, they're going to win those games. I think that they will, and just be ready for the USC hype train. That's all I'll say. Be ready for the USC hype train going into the Notre Dame game. If they have 8 wins going into Notre Dame, okay, even 8 or more, we'll say 8+. If they have 8+ wins going into Notre Dame, it's their last game of the season, as well as Notre Dame's. Now they may have a conference championship, to upcoming, that kind of a thing. But Man, if they're 8 or 9 wins going into that game, man, the hype train is going to be nuts going into that final game. You know, Notre Dame, if they've got 10 wins going into that game, you know, game day will be out there. It'll be, oh, USC is the future and all this stuff. And I just want to see Notre Dame just go in there and just smack them. Just physically put them to bed. That would be the ideal scenario for me. Hype them up. Do it. Hype them up like crazy. Sounds like fun. And then Notre Dame just puts the beat down physically on the Trojans just to remind them that they're not there yet. Like, that's what I want.
Man, I would love a beatdown in that last game. And especially because, I like Lee Corso, but he's going to be rocking that Trojan headgear, man, when he makes that pick. It's going to be happening, man. Yeah, it'll be something. But I mean, again, I think that we talked about it with North Carolina, and I kind of alluded to this to USC. They're the most volatile team, I think, on the schedule, because I think they could be a good team, or they could just be an average to like below average team. Like, I don't know exactly what you're going to get out of USC because, I mean, yeah, you're bringing up all this talent from Oklahoma, but Oklahoma wasn't exactly a great team last year either. So whenever you have a bad offensive line and a subpar defense, I have a hard time kind of buying into you. So we'll see.
Exactly. And look, you and I have coached, we played, we've been around football for a long time. It's great that you've got skill guys that can go out and do amazing things. That's awesome. You want that. You need that. But if you're asking me to put together a team, I'm starting on the inside and I'm working my way out. If you don't have good guys in the trenches, it's going to be tough. It's going to be really, really hard unless you just completely out-athlete everybody on your schedule. And that's just not going to be the case every game you play.
Not every week. No,
right.
Not every week.
Yeah.
I agree.
So I think that's where my skepticism of USC comes into play. Now, granted, look, we've got them as the 4th best team on Notre Dame's schedule. That's nothing to sneeze at, right? But they're not in the conversation with the top 2 teams, not even close, in my opinion. And it's going to take them a while to get there. And I will touch on your recruiting prowess right now, Ryan. They're not getting those big uglies on the recruiting trail really either at the moment. And so I don't know, man. If you're a USC fan, things aren't really looking good for the future either as far as the trenches are concerned.
Well, I mean, because I think the direct comparison is going to be obviously Lincoln Riley's the new head coach, right? Like, what happened at Oklahoma? They had all good offensive lines for the most part, but I even think to like the defense for a second, right? Like, there was always a problem under Oklahoma. Like, they got Alex Grinch to come in, and the defense was still a problem. They had a bunch of players that was drafted off that Oklahoma defense last year, and it still wasn't a good unit, right? Like,
right.
I think you're going to see the same deficiencies that you saw at Oklahoma, and again, Pac-12 schedule, their schedule is not difficult. So they're going to win some football games. It's not like this is going to be a bad team, right? But from a win-loss perspective. But I think that you're going to see when they play better teams, like I think someone mentioned Utah, right? Like if and when they play Utah, that's a physical football team, man. Like they're going to punch you in the mouth. And that's a different type of vibe to kind of how USC wants to play. So they will be able to out-athlete I don't even have their schedule in front of me, but like the Colorados of the world, the Washington States of the world, like you're going to be able to out-athlete some of those dudes, right? But I think at the end of it, defense and offensive and the ability to move people up front, like those things win football games. I just don't think that's USC this year.
They're out-of-conference games this season. They open with Rice. They have Fresno State week 3,
which is a decent team.
Yeah,
I mean, like a decent program. Yeah,
right. And then Notre Dame. Those are their 3 out-of-conference games. They've got Stanford, Oregon State, Arizona State, Washington State, Utah, Arizona, Cal, Colorado, and then UCLA. So
yeah,
they'll be able to out-athlete a lot of those teams. There's no question about it, And I also wonder what it's going to be like with Notre Dame playing USC the week after the UCLA game.
Sure.
That's a big emotional game on both sides of that rivalry, and to see what happens.
And their senior day, right? I mean, I would think
it is at UCLA.
Well, actually, no, it would be Notre Dame would be
Notre Dame's
day, right?
Senior
that's
day.
their last home game. Yep.
They're on the road, technically against UCLA. So, but no, I mean, coming off that emotional game
on the road in Los Angeles.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So, yeah, it is what it is. But yeah, so that's USC. They are the number 4 team on our list in our countdown here. The number 3 team from process of elimination should not shock too many people. It is the other independent team on Notre Dame's schedule, the BYU Cougars, to be played in Las Vegas in October. The Shamrock Series game for Notre Dame, of which they are undefeated in their Shamrock Series game. So there is that. But they are playing a formidable opponent this time around in BYU. That's not always the case when they play their Shamrock Series, usually by design. But this year they get to play in Sin City, which is going to be a very interesting scenario as well. So BYU comes in at 3. What are your thoughts on BYU coming into this thing, Ryan?
They're a really sneaky good football team, man.
Yeah.
I mean, they are. They're returning a lot. We just talked about all the weapons that the USC Trojans are bringing over, I should say. But BYU has some homegrown talent that I think is really interesting. Jaron Hall's returning as their quarterback. Had a nice season last year. It was banged up at some points, but they have a couple wide receivers back as well. Isaac Rex, their tight end, is returning from injury after missing, I think, a good portion of last season or all of last season almost. And Mason Wake at running back, who's a fullback, and he's kind of like a fullback H-back hybrid. So there's a lot of playmakers coming back for BYU, and their starting quarterback is returning, obviously, in Jaron Hall. Right. Their offensive line's good, man. They have a good left tackle in Blake Freeland. They have a good guard in Clark Barrington, who they're both going into their junior and redshirt junior seasons, respectively. So they play a physical brand of football. Obviously, they lost their running back last year, who they'll have to kind of find who their next bell cow type is at that spot. But I really like what they return offensively, especially. And then defensively, they have guys like Tyler Beatty, who's a really talented defensive lineman. He's like 6'5", 265, 270 pounds. They have Peyton Wilgar, who's a really talented linebacker as well. Chaz Ayu, who was at one time a really high recruit, also kind of playing that hybrid safety linebacker role. So when I think BYU, I think extreme physicality. I know that they're going to be ready to play as far as being physical up front on both sides of the football. They are pretty much a polar opposite to USC for me, right? Like they're going to play a physical, downhill brand of football, and they're going to play hard, and they're going to be a good, gritty football team. And I think that they're a team where, like, hey, man, if you're not ready, if you take them lightly or you go into that football game where you don't have your A game early, they can hit you in the mouth. Like they're a very physical brand of football.
And I will also say I like the fact of where it falls in the schedule. It comes after a bye week for Notre Dame. They can kind of almost reset a little bit after the beginning part of the schedule with Ohio State, Marshall, Cal, and UNC. So you're going to have a week off. That October 1st weekend is a week off for Notre Dame. So you got 2 weeks to prepare for BYU. And then after BYU, then you're looking at Stanford, UNLV, Syracuse. So all focus should be on BYU, right? I mean, there's really no reason that you should be looking ahead. You've got a week off, depending on how Marcus Freeman deals with his first bye week as a head coach. I think that that's going to be a very interesting thing as well, because all coaches kind of deal with the bye week differently. I believe that's right around midterms anyway, so there'll be a lot of academic stress there for the players. But I like where it falls in the schedule. Again, I don't feel like this is a game you can look past. You're going to Vegas. You're wearing the Shamrock Series uniforms, all of the things that the kids dig. That's big. And then this is a top 20 football team. I mean, and depending on what their record is going into the Notre Dame game, they start things off with South Florida, Baylor, Oregon, Wyoming, and Utah State before they see Notre Dame. That's either no losses or a one-loss situation, I would think, for BYU. So they're going to have a really good record coming in. Notre Dame should be a one-loss to no-loss team at that point. This could be a good football game, Ryan. I'm excited about this football game, and it was not difficult for us to put them at number 3.
And it's a neutral site game, like you're saying, right, out in Vegas, and it is a situation where it's the Shamrock Series game. So, I mean, BYU knows that too, right? Like they want to come in, they want to crash the party because that's like
100%.
That's like a big deal for Notre Dame fans. And I mean, we'll see what the crowd looks like if there's a split there. If there's, and it's gonna be. I mean, you're gonna be there in Vegas, right? So that'll be a fun time as well. So
absolutely.
It's going to be interesting, man. It's there's a lot of layers to that football game, and I think that BYU is returning a lot. Like again, they're losing their leading rusher, who's a good football player, but having Jaron Hall back, having Isaac Rex coming back from injury, having the offensive line back, and playing the physical brand of football defense that usually play, I think they're a tough out. Notre Dame should win, but BYU's I think is going to be a tough football game.
Look, 16 of 22 starters are returning. I mean, that might be one of the bigger numbers of any of the opponents that Notre Dame has on their schedule. That's a lot of returning talent, right? And we all know that BYU is generally older than other teams as well. So they're returning talent. They're going to be mature about it. You know, this is going to be a tough out for Notre Dame. There's no question about it. I mean, it's, again, we're talking about the number 3 team on Notre Dame's schedule. And granted, there's a drop off from 1 and 2, I think, to number 3. But at the same time, this is a tough game. But I like where it lands on Notre Dame's schedule. I like kind of how Notre Dame matches up with these guys. And we'll get more into that when we talk about BYU specifically. But I like the matchups here in this game. I really do. I think it benefits Notre Dame, but it's going to be a physical ball game. And depending on how Notre Dame deals with the time zones and all of that different stuff and all the extra noise, it's not going to be easy. This one's not going to be easy. All right, let's move on to the top 2 teams on the schedule. I don't think this is a huge surprise to a lot of people, but the number 2 team for Notre Dame comes to Notre Dame Stadium on November 5th. It's a night game already scheduled at Notre Dame Stadium. The Clemson Tigers roll in for the much ballyhooed matchup with the Tigers. This is going to be an interesting game, Ryan. I think that, you know, you've got Clemson coming in with everything that Clemson is. Notre Dame obviously beat Clemson the last time they were here at Notre Dame Stadium. It was an empty stadium for the most part, which obviously is not good. But Notre Dame was able to win that battle. Granted, Clemson was missing a few guys, and that benefited Notre Dame. They went into overtime. They won that game, so they've got that win under their belts, which is awesome. This game, I feel like, is going to be a little bit different. They still are going to face the same quarterback in Uwe Ongalale, DJ. I like that matchup. That kid is stuck in the pocket. He doesn't really have an opportunity to escape the pocket very often. I think Notre Dame is going to keep him right there. I think they're going to put a ton of pressure on him. But Clemson, I mean, look, it's still Clemson. They haven't completely fallen off the map. For as bad as they were last year, and you know, they started out, I think, 3-4, I want to say, off the top of my head. I'm pulling up their record from last year. They started 0-1, 2-1, 2-2. So they started off 2-2 last year, and everybody was just leaving them for dead, which to your own peril, they were a 10-win football team last year, which I think people forget based on the way they started out, and they were out of the national championship hunt pretty early after their losses to Georgia and NC State. And then, of course, they lost another game to Pitt, which at that point made them 4-3. And everybody's like, well, you know, Clemson's done, so we're not really going to pay attention to them. But then they finished the season on a 6-game win streak, beating Florida State, Louisville, UConn, Wake Forest, South Carolina. And then they beat Iowa State in the Cheez-It Bowl, right? So they finished the season on a 6-0 tear, and they ended up with 10 wins on the season, Ryan. And I think people forget about that based on the way they started the season. This is no slouch. They're picked to win the ACC again. They are a top 5 team, depending on what publication you're looking at. This team's going to be tough. And I like the fact that it's at Notre Dame Stadium. I like the fact that it's in November, obviously. I like the fact that it's going to be a full stadium this time around as opposed to 2 years ago when Clemson came around. But this is going to be a very, very tough game for Notre Dame and for Marcus Freeman.
No, it definitely is, and I apologize for a little bit of technical difficulties on my side there. But Clemson is, I mean, they're going to be a tough out, Vince. I mean, Dabo Swinney has created a program that is built off of consistency, right? And even in a down year, like you were saying, they still win 10 football games, right? Like it's a double-digit win team. I mean, so that defense, I think we'll have a general understanding as far as how good the Notre Dame offensive line or how much they've improved by this game. Obviously, like we'll get that first few games of the year, but this is a test, man. Like if Notre Dame is really back and offensive line U is back and they're able to run the football, this is the game that you need to be able to do because you're facing off against guys like Miles Murphy, Tyler Davis, Brian Bresee, Xavier Thomas, KJ Henry, the best defensive line that you're going to play by far, probably the best defensive line in college football. And then you get Trenton Simpson, who's a dynamic player on the second level. Andrew Makuba is a pretty good football player at safety. Defense is gonna stress you, man. Like, it's going to be a game where you have to be physical, you have to play well, and that defense is going to put you through the ringer. It's not going to be a simple game where, you're going to be able to just kind of do what you want offensively. You're going to have to be able to you're going to have to be assert yourself on that side of the football. But to your point, the biggest question is, what are you going to get offensively? DJ Uiagalelei was not a great football player last year, and there were a lot of reasons why. It wasn't fully his fault, but the offensive line wasn't great. You have pretty much everyone coming back. That should be to your advantage. I mean, you would expect Walker Parks to be a better player in year 3. You would expect Jordan McFadden to continue to be a good football player at left tackle. Marcus Tate, I know, started some games there as a freshman last year and did a solid job. So you would expect them to be better. I hope that, especially with the new coaches that are going to be calling on both sides of the football, I would hope there would just be a different structure offensively, because I do think that there's a world where DJ Uiagalelei can be a good football player. It's just last year, I felt like the offense just didn't fit his style, right? Like, Tony Elliott just was not a good fit with him from a scheme perspective. But you have Joseph Ngata, you have Bo Collins, you have Brandon Spector, you have EJ Williams. There's some talent. The question is, do they have anything dynamic as far as after catch, winning down the football field, not just with your size? So if they're an improved football team on the offensive side of the football, Will Shipley coming back at running back, Kobe Pace is a pretty good player as well, then they're a really tough team. Then they're a potentially elite team, because that defense is absolutely going to be elite. Like, there's no doubt in my mind.
The front, it's going to be the best front seven I think that Notre Dame faces all season. To be honest with you, I don't think it's even all that close. And you're right. Notre Dame, in order to win this game, they're going to have to be multifaceted offensively. They don't have to run for 200 yards. Okay, but they need to at least be able to run when they want to run the football to open up the passing game that they're obviously going to need to win as well. I like Notre Dame throwing the ball in this game, but they have to be able to run the ball. Otherwise, a one-dimensional team is just not very good, period. So they have to be able to run the ball. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a huge challenge. I absolutely love Notre Dame's defense against Clemson's offense. I do. Especially when you get to this point in the season, you're into November. We're going to know who Notre Dame is by that point, and we're going to have a pretty good idea of who Clemson is at that point. I think we're going to love that matchup. As people who follow Notre Dame, I think the Notre Dame defense matching against the Clemson offense, I like that matchup. I really do. It's going to, for me, I think this game's going to come down to what the Notre Dame offense can do against the Clemson defense.
I don't disagree. I think both defenses don't hate their matchups against the other offense, right? Like, I think Notre Dame's going to have a good offense, and I think that you feel good about what Tyler Buchner and that cast is going to do. But when you're Clemson, that you have all those elite players coming back, I don't think you fear any opposing offense, right? And I think especially with what you saw from Clemson offensively, I think Notre Dame's going to go into that game, at least right now, in their minds and say, like, we feel good about our chances in that football game. So could be a defensive football game, or it could be completely different than what we're thinking, because, I mean, Clemson could take a step forward. Notre Dame could take a step forward offensively speaking. They could both still have good defenses, but if their offenses are clicking at a different level, then this might be a different football game than we're anticipating. Right now, I would say it's probably a more low-scoring affair, because I expect both defenses to be pretty legit on both sides of the football. And I agree. I think it's going to come down to which quarterback is able to make a bigger impact on the game. Right? I mean, it's going to be, at that point, you're going to know what you have in Tyler Buchner. It's either Buckner's going to step forward, or DJ Uiagalelei is going to have kind of a flip the script type of performance throughout the season. I don't really anticipate it, but it's a very interesting football game. And I mean, if they can run the football against Clemson, then they're going to be in a good spot, because that front seven it's pretty good, man. Pretty good.
That's going to be the key. Completely agree. You've got to keep them off balance when it comes to running the football. You're not going to be able to just run between the tackles all the time. You're going to have to go inside. You're going to have to go outside. You're going to have to RPO them. You're going to have to stretch the defense. You're going to have to do a lot of things offensively in order to be successful against this defense. And hopefully by then we will have seen it from Notre Dame's offense, but that's still a question mark going in. We both think that they're going to be pretty good. Irish Breakdown, I think, thinks that Notre Dame's offense is going to be pretty good. I think by November 5th, we're going to have a really good idea of where Notre Dame is at that point. So should be a fun matchup. Right now, I like Notre Dame's chances in that game, but a lot of things can change between now and November 5th. So really looking forward to that one, especially considering I really do think the fact that fans are going to be in the building is going to make a difference. I really do. The atmosphere is going to be light years different than it was the last time Clemson stepped foot on Notre Dame's campus, right? And they left with a loss. So that might be the X factor going into this thing. Clemson might know what they're expecting coming into Notre Dame Stadium, but it's going to be completely different.
I agree completely. I mean, it's going to be a completely different atmosphere than the last time they were in Notre Dame Stadium, and I think that really works into their favor. Obviously, I think that for me, look, there was a big asterisk next to the Notre Dame victory over Clemson a couple years ago because Trevor Lawrence didn't play. Obviously, we've talked enough about that ad nauseum at this point. But the point is that Notre Dame knows that they can beat Clemson, right? Because they've literally done it. Yeah, it's huge. It's like the chip off. It's like the chip off your shoulder, right? Like it's the monkey off your back. That's the thing where you know that it's possible. You know that you have done it now, and they don't care about the circumstances as far as Trevor Lawrence. They know that they can beat Clemson. So, again, physical football game, but having them at home, I think, is a big thing for Notre Dame coming into the season.
Huge. And hey, man, as a fan and as somebody that covers the team, I can't wait for that game. It's going to be awesome. I am really looking forward to that one. But hey, we got some time between now and then. All right. The wait is finally over. This is the most unclimactic number one team on Notre Dame's schedule. I think we all knew that this was going to be the case, but it is clear that it is going to be the Ohio State Buckeyes. The first game of the season on the road, September 3rd. We've had it circled on the calendar for years. Going to the Horseshoe. I mean, look, this is going to be a very, very, very difficult game going in for Notre Dame. They don't have the tune-up game that, everybody thinks that a lot of people think they should have going into Ohio State. I could easily, if this was a debate, I could take either side of the debate as to whether they should have a tune-up game or whether they should not have a tune-up game going into this thing, because I think the big question marks for Notre Dame going into the Ohio State game are the unknowns. Like the unknowns, I think, can help Notre Dame against Ohio State, as opposed to if they had a game under their belts, they got film, they, as in Ohio State, would have film on Notre Dame, etc. But the bottom line is this is going to be, I think, the biggest test for Notre Dame throughout the entire season. And they get them week 1.
Yeah. I don't think that you're going to get a full scope as far as what exactly Notre Dame is as a football team after week 1, but I think you're going to get a pretty good early indication, right? Like you're playing a team that has been a perennial power, has won a lot of football games. They have as much offensive firepower as any team that you're going to see, even more than USC. Even more than USC, because you have CJ Stroud, who's a Heisman Trophy finalist. You have Travion Henderson, who's the best running back you're going to see all season. Marvin Harrison Jr., Jackson Smith, and Jigba, who just went over 1,600 yards playing with 2 other first-round wide receivers. Julian Fleming, Emeka. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, so we'll just call him Big E as the other wide receiver there. And I expect the offensive line to be better. Last year, it was not good. Like, it just was not. Nicholas Petit-Frere, I thought, was a very overrated football player. I thought that Dyer Munford took a step back moving inside the guard. They had some shuffling at center, obviously. I think Luke Whippler did a good job coming in for Harry Miller. But you're still working with a couple of knowns up front because you have Paris Johnson kicking out the left tackle. I think Paris is going to be a good football player, so I think he's going to be a good left tackle for them. Really talented kid. But you have Donovan Jackson, who's going to be stepping in for the first time as a redshirt freshman. And Matthew Jones is now going to be the full-time starter, not just kind of rotating in. So you have a couple guys playing in new spots on the offensive line, but there's a lot of talent up front. DeJuan Jones is a talented player, although I think he should get in a little bit better of shape. Paris Johnson is a first-round level talent. We'll see how he's developed. Donovan Jackson, I'm told, is going to be a dude. And I thought Luke Whippler was probably their most, not their best, but their most consistent offensive lineman last year. And they have Justin Fry coming in from UCLA. So I think their offensive line is going to take a huge step forward. And I think it's just going to be a better football team. And they have, obviously, offensive firepower. My biggest question is, what is the defense going to look like in game 1? We've talked a lot about Jim Knowles' defense first couple games of the season or first season in general. They are usually a little bit of a slow starts. Ohio State does have talents defensively. I mean, you have guys like Zach Harrison and JT at the other defensive end, and Tyleek Williams, who's a good football player. Still Chambers, after transitioning from running back over to linebacker, I thought had some really nice moments last year. Cameron Brown's a pretty solid corner. Ronnie Hickman was maybe their best defensive player last year overall. So there's some talent, but the defense wasn't great last year, and now you're breaking in a new system. So I expect Notre Dame to have success offensively, but I also expect Ohio State to have a lot of success offensively as well. Not because Notre Dame's defense isn't good, just because they
really
have dudes
good
everywhere.
Yeah,
they're really good. They should have an improved offensive line, and they have first-round players all around the offensive skill position. So I think it's going to be a high-scoring game. It's really going to depend on what is Jim Knowles' defense going to look like game one. That's the biggest question that I have in Ohio State, but there's surely talent everywhere.
I think getting them week one is huge for many reasons. Like I said, I think the question marks for Notre Dame help them going into this game. I think that's a big one. I also think that Ohio State gets better as the season goes on.
Sure.
So getting them week one benefits Notre Dame in that regard. Now, how much, that remains to be seen. There was a comment in here that I want to bring up because I think it's very important to understand as well. JWick 13 says, I think regardless of how the game goes, the number one thing is to not overreact to the outcome. And I think that goes for whether Notre Dame wins or whether Notre Dame loses.
Sure.
Don't overreact, because if they win this game, people are going to, be celebrating in the streets. It's going to be crazy. It's going to be electric.
It's Super Bowl.
And if they lose, it's going to be Marcus Freeman needs to be fired. He's not the guy. We told you he couldn't win. We got another guy who can't win the big game. And don't overreact either way, right?
Yep.
Either way, I still believe Notre Dame is going to be a really good team this year, okay? Ohio State's really, really, really good. They have talent across the board. So Notre Dame's going to get tested early and often in that game, which, guess what? That's why I like watching college football.
Yeah. Hey, man. I think the one thing is, I don't want it to be a blowout. I want Notre Dame to win, but I want it to be a good competitive football game, right? I want to see good football be played. And I think that it is going to be a good football game. I keep having Ohio State people ask me, what do I expect? I expect a competitive football game. Where it goes from there, I mean, you could convince me, you can give me 10 different reasons why it can go either way. That Notre Dame wins, that Ohio State wins. And I know we're going to dive a lot deeper into that, leading up to the game. But regardless, I think Notre Dame's going to come to play. I mean, at one point, Vince, I haven't seen the spread lately, but it was 14 points at one point, or 13 and a half.
Yeah.
It's disrespectful, man. It's disrespectful. Even if you don't respect Notre Dame, to think in the game one, in the new era of Marcus Freeman, that they're going to go out and lose by 2 touchdowns, I think that's disrespectful, man. I'm not even saying that they're going to win outright. I'm just saying, you don't even think it's going to be competitive.
Exactly.
The line says it's not going to really be a competitive football game. So I think Notre Dame, I think it's going to be a good game. I think Notre Dame is going to be competitive, but it is a big measuring stick. You're going to have a very quick indication, not only from a national perspective, but also I'm a recruiting guy. So it's going to have a lot of recruiting implications, man. People are going to look at that game and be like, oh, they're either going to be like, oh, Notre Dame's real, or they're going to say, maybe things haven't changed that much, right? And I think that's going to be a huge momentum either way, negative or positive. But I think that Notre Dame has a chance to show themselves very well to open up the season, which is it's going to be a lot of fun. Man.
It's going to be great. There hasn't been a season opener like this that I've been looking forward to more because of the on-field product, because of everything that's been going on in the offseason for Notre Dame, off the field. I have been looking forward to this big time, and it's going to be a lot of fun either way. As long as Notre Dame doesn't get blown out, which I don't think will happen. I agree with you that it's disrespectful, and it's a line I'm willing to jump on. I'll tell you that right now. I think Notre Dame 100%. Can keep in those 2 touchdowns. I really, really do. So
I agree.
It's going to be fun. And, I've heard the horrors, I've heard the tales, but I'm excited to go to Ohio State as well and see what the fuss is about. You know what I mean? So that's going to be fun too. So that's going to do it for this portion of the broadcast. Stick around because we are going to do a mailbag. Start throwing your questions in now, and Ryan and I will do our best to answer all of your questions. But this is going to be the end of the first section of the podcast. So make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share with your friends, give us a 5-star review on the podcast as well. and we really appreciate it. We will be back tomorrow with a brand new topic, of course, with our normal 1 o'clock start time. I'm not sure what that topic is yet, so stay tuned. You never know what we're going to come back with. We got a bunch of stuff kind of in the hopper that we're kind of rolling around with and seeing where we're at, but we will be back at 1 o'clock tomorrow, so make sure you stick around. Moving forward with our mailbag, again, make sure you get your questions in, and we will do our best to answer them, star them, do all that fun stuff, and Ryan and I will stick around for as long as we possibly can and answer some questions here for you. Okay, here we go. Here's the first question here from the world-famous Scotty Nitro. Hey, Ryan, do you think it's a better fit amongst the current quarterbacks we are recruiting? Not just who's the best quarterback, but who fits into Tommy's system best?
It's a great question. I would say when we're talking about Austin Novosad or Kenny Minchey, I think both of them are actually good fits into the system, right? I mean, in Coach Reese's offense, timing's a big thing. Getting the ball out of your hand quickly, being a quick processor are very important things. And I think both Novosad and Minchey do those things really well. And now Novosad's a 6'3", a little bit longer of a player, while Kenny Minchey's around 6'1" and kind of a stockier frame. So it's going to look a little different. But honestly, I don't know if I can really differentiate the fit in the system. I think they both can fit well. I like the RPO game that I know that they want to implement a little more. I like that a little better for Minchey. I think he just has a little bit of a quicker release in that regard. So if we want to take the full scope of the offensive system, I guess I would slightly go Minchey. But I also think that Austin Novosad has a really good fit into the offense as well.
Okay, next up, Blaine Tiller says, We'll have more rushing yards in the Notre Dame BC game. Tyler Buckner or Phil Dracovic? I think this is a good question.
I would certainly hope it'd be Tyler Buckner, right? I mean, Phil's, for me, I don't know what you think, Vince, but like Phil Dracovic for me is more of a extender as a passer, right? Like he can break tackles. He
They're
can
not running a lot
plays,
of zone reads per se with him. Yeah,
exactly.
Right,
and he's not even, I mean, even outside of structure, he's not really looking to pull the football and run a ton, you know, like he's trying to extend as a passer because he's got the big arm and he's works out of structure a little bit. I mean, I think there is some comparisons between him and like a young Ben Roethlisberger, you know, the ability to kind of shrug things off in the pocket, break, throw the football, but I don't think he's going to run the football a ton, right? But so Tyler's always going to have the little wrinkles at times, quarterback power, zone read, you know, working out of structure. So I think I would say Tyler Buckner in that regard.
Now I could see some QB power with Phil, you know, so, you know, it's just some design keep sort of things, but I don't think he's going to be as active in like the zone read game and things of that nature. So if Phil Dracovic has more rushing yards than Tyler Buckner, that's a bad sign for Notre Dame, I think. Or I guess you could say it's a good sign because Tyler Buckner's just sitting back there in the pocket, just, you know, picking them apart, and Phil's running for his life. So, I mean, I guess that could be a bonus depending on how the game goes. But I think if everything remains as planned by the coaching staff from both sides, I think TB has more rushing yards. I think it's a good point.
Agree.
Okay, here we go from Will Claw. Any update on Hannafin?
Yeah, so obviously you should be a part of the message board, and I think, Will, that you are, which I know is why you're asking the question. So for anybody that out there that doesn't really know, you can sign up at boards.irishbreakdown.com, which is right underneath of me. So the whole thing is that I'll say this because there's an intel piece on the board that you can kind of look at that Brian put up that has a little more in-depth information that we don't really want to put out into the universe. It's more for the subscribers. I'll say this: everyone that we've talked with, still feels that they are the leader for Ronan Hannafin. So I'm not worried about it yet. There's just some uneasiness kind of with the whole process. But I will say right now, I think that Notre Dame is still the number one team for Ronan Hannafin. So we'll just keep it there for now.
I like that. Okay. Oops. Gotta go over here. Here we go. Jesus, Mary, and Brandon Joseph. Very funny. I like that. With the loss of Moore on the defensive side, are we looking for another defensive tackle lineman in this recruiting class?
I haven't heard of any guys that is going to kind of be a replacement for Jason Moore. I think Notre Dame's going to be okay with just taking 4. Honestly, I think that when you have a group like Keon Keeley and Brennan Vernon and Boubacar Traore and Devin Houston, I think you're okay with just taking the 4 because Jason Moore was going to turn that group from elite to historical, right? If they were able to recruit him, but it's still a great class. I think that it's going to rival any defensive line group in the 2023 cycle across the country. So I don't think that they're going to force the issue. If there's another player that kind of pops up to them, like me and Brian have talked a little bit about Colton Vasek, who's out of Westlake, who was a guy that was offered at one point, but we haven't heard any rumblings that they're making it a priority to definitely get a fifth in the class. Or I don't know if there's anybody on the board right now that they would make that necessary push. So I think they're going to be okay with 4. Just be open to there's going to continue to be constant evaluation, especially when we go into the season where, you know, what kids take big jumps, what kids that you didn't really know about that you're constantly in the evaluation process early in the season. So that could change ultimately at the end.
Timeout Tom says yesterday when Ivy was talking about options at quarterback, John Garcia mentioned in passing there's a top 5-ish quarterback that isn't as committed as people think. What was he talking about? Well, I wasn't on the show yesterday, so I'm not 100% sure. And our buddy Ryan just fell out with technical difficulties. So let me see if there is a question that I can answer while we wait for him to come back. And then we will, of course, roll back to that question. Are you back, Brian or Ryan?
I'm back. I'm back. I'm sorry.
All right. No. That's it. You went out right when I was reading a question that I cannot answer.
I know, man. I know. I'm just so frustrated. I haven't had any technical issues for weeks, and then all of a sudden today it's like, oh yeah, let's all mess things up.
Of course. That's how it always goes. So time out. Go ahead. You read the question.
No, I read the question. I heard you reading it as you were kind of going through it. Time. I can't tell you. I'm sorry. I've talked to Brian about it. I know who it is. I know the quarterback that they're referring to. It's a pretty crazy one, but we will. I can't put a name out there. I apologize, but maybe at some point when it's about to break, maybe we can put it on the message board. I don't know, but I don't want to ruin that kid's process, right? So I can't put that in the universe, unfortunately.
You can tell me after the show.
Yes, I will.
Some of the perks of working for IB. All right. Next question. SGC. Concerning Al Golden, does his experience in the NFL make him a more effective college defensive coordinator?
I think it's all of his experiences, right? I mean, he's literally been defensive coordinator, head coach on the college level at multiple spots. He's been a linebacker coach for a team that just played in the Super Bowl. He's been there, done that. He's seen a lot of different styles, a lot of different schemes. I think Al Golden's going to do really well because I think he's a really smart, and every person I've ever talked to, from just general media people that have covered him closely, and scouts that have been around him in the past, he's a really smart guy. And I think that he's going to do really good stuff for Notre Dame defensively.
And I think it's the wholeness of his resume that is the big deal with him, right? I mean, he's got a great resume, and you just rattled off the various things that he's done. The NFL just makes that resume better, frankly. And people have to understand the NFL isn't college. You can't implement defenses necessarily as technical as you are going to do in the NFL because you just don't have that much time with these kids. It's not their full-time job. They're going to school. They're doing all of these different things, right? And so it's different. Now, can that experience help him? Absolutely. All of his experiences he's had in his career help him with the position that he is currently in. So, yes, every position he's ever had makes him a more effective defensive coordinator, I think. But the NFL just makes it that much better.
100%.
Benjamin has a question. I want to know what you guys think about this Notre Dame team. When we make the playoff, who is the opponent?
Wow, that's a question.
Yeah,
So in Notre Dame's schedule, they're going to play potentially the top team in the ACC, potentially the top team in the Big Ten. And I guess we're assuming that we're going to win those football games and that we're going to beat USC, who could be the best team in the Pac-12. So I guess that
I think they could lose one of those games and still be okay with getting. Sure, I think an 11-1 team, if they lose to one of those teams, they still get into the playoff. It's barring four undefeated teams, obviously.
Yeah, my first thought is winner of the SEC, right? Like, I mean, that would be because that's one of the conferences that we would not play.
Right.
I mean, it really depends on
they don't
how
want a
things
rematch
shake
in
out.
there. That's a good point.
100%. I mean, but like, let's say this, Vince. Like, what if Notre Dame loses a close game to Ohio State, and then you run the table the rest of the way? You go 11-1, you get in the playoff, you're the 4 seed, whatever. Ohio State's there again. Maybe you have a rematch against Ohio State, right? Like, there was a good football game first. There's a lot. I mean, I wish that I can give a better answer for you, Benjamin. I would just say it's going to be most likely a team that you haven't played, so an SEC caliber team potentially, or maybe it's a rematch. I don't know. That's a tough question to answer.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. If they're 11-1, I think they're probably a 3 or a 4 seed, right? So the winner of the SEC, I think, is a very safe bet. They do try to avoid rematches, and I think that's smart, to be honest with you.
Sure.
Yep. And so, yeah, I like that because potentially you're looking at Clemson, Ohio State, Notre Dame, and the winner of the SEC as the Final Four. And I don't think that's a huge stretch, to be honest with you. So if we're going by this question, Notre Dame's in, so they're in.
Mm-hmm.
Who else is going to be in? I think that's a logical step to take. I don't necessarily see anybody from the Pac-12 getting in. I have a hard time seeing anybody from the Big 12 getting in. I just don't. So the process of elimination, right? So
maybe Cincinnati will get in again.
Yeah. I wouldn't have predicted that at the beginning of last season. So you never know.
Yep.
Okay, next up in the hopper is Irishman 7114. How do you think that USC, with the way the O-lines and defenses go under Riley, slide into the Big Ten? I don't see them physically matching up with Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, etc. regularly. I think that's a great point, frankly.
It is a great point.
And let me go back to the original preface the original point that we were making when we were talking about these moves. They're not doing it for competition purposes. They're doing it for the almighty dollar. So it is not a good fit for UCLA and USC to be in the Big Ten with the way that they play the game. It's just not. And they're going to struggle against physical teams. It's not a great fit. And I can guarantee you, if you gave the truth serum to Lincoln Riley, he's not happy about this move.
Yeah, it's a clashing of styles, to say the least, right? It's I guess you could argue that Ohio State's been a little similar, right? Because like they haven't been the strongest team up front the last couple of years, and they've still been a really good team. I think that you can win in a different style. I just think that early on, you're just going to kind of have to understand how you're going to proactively play against teams that are a different style to you, right? Like they're going to be a more physical football team, but they're maybe not going to have the same athletes that you're going to have unless you're playing Ohio State out wide, right? So I think early on it's going to be a huge adjustment period for USC, but if they can recruit, and they're going to be able to recruit a little bit of a different demographic too, playing in the Big Ten as well. So I think you just have to mesh them together. But I think that it's going to be it's going to be a tough transition early, but I think it's something where you can figure it out as long as you have the right pieces in place.
Right. I think that's a good call. Blaine Tiller asked this earlier, but just to ask again, in the Ohio State game, do you think Notre Dame holds Ohio State to under 28 points, which is what Oregon held them to in their win last year?
Could they? I mean, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's possible. You don't think so? 28's too small for you, Vince?
Well, you said earlier it was going to be a shootout, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. Could they do that? Do they have the ability to do that? Yes, I think they do. I think if you're going to hold Ohio State under 28 points, I think you've caused a few turnovers defensively. I think you've gotten into the backfield. I think that you have disrupted what CJ Stroud wants to do with the football. A lot has gone your way defensively for you to hold Notre Dame or hold Ohio State under 28. If they hold Ohio State under 28, I love Notre Dame's chances to win that game. So if that's the case, that would be fantastic. If you told me that they hold them under 28, I like Notre Dame. I think that they're going to win that game. So I hope it happens, and I see a path for that to happen. I don't know that I would predict that to happen.
Can I set the over-under for you, Vince, and you let me know? Ready? I'm going to set it. I love this game. 33.5.
Oh, that's a good number, too.
That is a good number.
Because I had 35 in my head. Like that's realistic.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, I'll say over just because I don't want to be that homer just yet. I'm not ready to take that plunge. I'll take the over on that, but that's a really solid number right there. Really solid.
Yeah. I spend too much time looking at betting lines, man. I'm sorry.
I don't blame you. I think betting lines are fun. I think it's very interesting to see how people think of Notre Dame. Brian and I were talking the other day about the over-unders for wins for Notre Dame and just how crazy it's been over the last 5 years.
Wasn't it Pro Football Focus had them at like 6 point something wins or something, some crazy number like that?
I'm sorry. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
I don't get it. It's 8.5 again this year. It's 8.5. I don't know how you don't take that, but whatever. Whatever. I don't work in Vegas. I don't make those salaries. So they obviously are making money on the deal. So
it's true.
Okay. John Arundel says, is Monroe Freeling still on Notre Dame's board?
John, we've talked a little bit about this on the message board. We're going to wait until a decision is made from Monroe's side to kind of put the full backstory out there. As it currently stands, I do not expect Monroe Freeling to be a part of the Notre Dame class. Could it change? Sure, he's still on the board. Yes, Notre Dame is still recruiting Monroe Freeling, to my knowledge. But I just think that there's a little bit of a trending away from both sides. There's just a little bit of a backstory that we have to get into on the premium message board at some point.
All right. Next question is from John Murray. I believe Ryan Barnes will be a starter by week 4 or 5. What say you?
Yeah, I think that I'm hopeful for Ryan Barnes. I really like the talent level of Ryan, and I mean he brings a lot of length at 6'2.5", 6'3", somewhere in that ballpark. So I think if hopefully they're able to find a role, if this does happen, if this switch does happen, I hope they find a spot for Clarence Lewis, because I don't think that I think Clarence Lewis can be an asset to your team, to your secondary, right? Like, I don't think he's a guy that should just be phased out completely. I think that Ryan Barnes presents more upside, but I think the ability to potentially get both of them on the field could be very interesting. So hoping that that if Ryan Barnes beats him out, it's because Ryan Barnes is just too good to keep off the field.
Right. Absolutely. And by week 4, that means something has gone badly for Clarence Lewis in games, I think. If Clarence Lewis is playing well, I don't see him getting replaced. You know what I mean? And so it's either going to be Ryan Barnes is starting in week 1 so that he's still starting week 4, or Clarence Lewis has started week 1 and something has gone drastically wrong so that Ryan Barnes is starting now. Like, I'm okay with scenario 1. I'm not okay with scenario 2, right? So, I mean, I guess we'll see how things go, but I really hope that Clarence Lewis isn't getting beat like a drum and that they have to make a change, by week 4.
Exactly. I hope that a change is happening because the player is stepping up, not because one is not performing, right? Like, I think that's the most advantageous. Ryan Barnes just needs to be too good to keep off the field. Like, he has to play. That's where I think that's the ideal situation, obviously. You don't want it to just be Clarence isn't playing well, so you have to replace him.
Exactly. Yep, completely agree. Question here from Sean Kane. Do you see Ramon Henderson as the starter at safety opposite Joseph, or more of a rotation?
I think that we've talked about this a lot too, Vince. I think whether it's Xavier Watts or it's a Ramon Henderson, I think there's a lot of upside to that other safety spot. I do think that if it's Ramon, there is a lot of upside from a range perspective, right? Like, he brings a lot of coverage versatility for me. So I would predict him right now as the starter, but again, it's going to be a battle. There's experienced guys like DJ Brown and Houston Griffith. There's another young guy like Xavier Watts that's really talented. So I think that it's going to be a nice battle in the fall, looking at if Ramon's able to get that spot.
Yep, I predict him as the starter at the moment, but a lot can change because I think there's a lot of talent back there, and I think the talent is very close. So yeah, I predict him to be the starter, but we'll see what happens. Blaine Tiller has a couple of interesting ones here, and we'll kind of roll through them. But he says, Will finished higher ranked this year nationally, the Notre Dame wide receiver core or Notre Dame as a team? I got the team. I think the team's going to finish higher.
Yeah. I'll go with the team on that one.
And it's not because I don't think this wide receiving core can be really good, but there's a lot of really good wide receiving cores out there and that are deeper, frankly, than Notre Dame. So, yeah, I'm going to go with the team. I think the team's going to finish higher.
And also, how are we ranking the wide receiver units as well? Like I think that's
what's the
a
criteria?
conversation. Are we talking about are they generally based on performance? Is it a volume stat outcome? Is it just
Right.
us tentatively ranking against other teams? I think that matters a little bit. But
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree with that as well. He's got another one here. Which finishes the year higher ranked, the Notre Dame wide receiving core or the Notre Dame secondary?
I'd go secondary. I think there's more proven products right now. I think Brandon Joseph is going to be a star. Blaine, I also think that Cam Hart is going to take a massive step forward and be a star for the team. So as long as the other players like the Tariq Bracy in the slot plays well, as long as Clarence Lewis plays good football, as long as Barnes plays solid football, as long as Ramon Henderson plays solid football, you just need everybody else to be solid. If everybody's solid and you have your 2 stars, I think the secondary has a lot of upside.
Absolutely. And I will agree with you on the known commodities versus what we think the wide receiving core can be. If I'm predicting right now, I think the secondary is going to be better because I know what I'm getting from at least half of them. And I don't know what I'm going to get from Braden Lindsey. I got a lot of good ideas. I don't know what I'm going to get from Avery Davis coming off of an injury. I don't know what I'm going to get from Tobias Merriweather. I don't know what I'm going to get from, Colsey. There's a lot of question marks there. So I think that are going to get answered in a positive way. But at the same time, I just don't know where they're going to be with that. So it's going to be interesting. But right now, I would have to take the secondary for sure. Will has an interesting one here. He says, will any of the 23 or 24 recruits travel with the team to Columbus? Now, Will, I'm going to ask you to clarify this because it is an away game. So Notre Dame can't give tickets to recruits at away games. If they go, they're going on their own. They're going on their own dime. So it has nothing to do with Notre Dame specifically. But if they go to the game, it's on them. So Notre Dame's not going to bring a bunch of recruits. They can't. That's illegal. You can't do that to an away game. So I don't know if that's what you were referring to, or if they've got like a plan that they're going to all go together or something along those lines. Maybe Ryan can speak more to that. But from a Notre Dame standpoint, they can't bring recruits on the road.
Exactly. Yeah. I saw the question earlier. So, Notre Dame is, especially if it's like an official visit, right? Like they're not paying for them to go to Ohio State, but it's, it could be something though, Will, to your question where, it's not, maybe a player is getting recruited by both Ohio State and Notre Dame. And that's a game that you want to see, obviously, right? Like that's a big, obviously barometer point. So
Sure.
Notre Dame's not going to push them to go to Ohio State. They're going to push them to go to the Clemson game, right? Like the home games is where you're going to see their recruits coming in.
Yep, that'll be a huge recruiting weekend for Notre Dame.
Clemson is good. I'll tell you all this. I haven't put it on the board yet, but I've already gotten some people verifying that they're going to come for the Clemson game, and there are some dudes that will be on campus for that game.
From the 24 class or
for 2023 and 2024. There's a bunch of guys already planning that visit. Yep.
Wouldn't be surprised if we made some 25 guys on campus too that weekend. Just saying.
Nah. Might be some 28 kids on there too.
Yeah, right. Be crawling out of the crib for that one. All right, James Lawrence Zenchi has one here for us. Ben, I'm going to butcher this. I'm most likely Minnick. Is it Minnick or Minich?
I'm not 100% sure. I don't know his last name, to be honest.
He visits later this month. We touched on this the other day. I don't see it at safety, but I could see him as a slot wide receiver. He's definitely a gamer. Is Notre Dame looking at him at safety or wide receiver?
Safety, to my knowledge, James. I haven't heard anything about him potentially playing wide receiver if he does come up with Notre Dame. He's going to be on campus, obviously, for the 26th, which is the barbecue. He's going to be one of the very few 2023 kids that are going to be there, and everything I've heard is that they are looking at him as a safety.
Okay, we got one right here from Stephen Robinson. Over under 16 and a half runs for Buckner against Ohio State.
That's a big number.
If it's over, that's a problem because that means he got sacked. That means he's running for his life. I think I would have liked this number more at like 8.5, 9.5. I felt like would be a better number here for this one. I think 16 and a half is too high of a number, to be honest with you. And again, if it's over that, then I think things have gotten really bad for Notre Dame. They're not going to have They're not going to have 17 designed runs for Tyler Buckner. That's for darn sure. I don't see that happening. If because in college, of course, sacks count as carries. So if he is in there for 16 and a half, I think he's been sacked. I think bad things have happened. So what say you, Ryan?
The number that popped in my head was, I think the most that you'll see is 11 to 12.
Okay.
I mean, it kind of design quarterback. What'd you say? 9.5 is kind of where you would set it.
That's where I put the number 9.5, Yeah.
I'd probably go over on that one, but I mean, 16 and a half is a massive number, man. So I would definitely hit the number on that, on the under on that one, Steven.
I just think that things have gone wrong if it's that high. Like that is not in the script for Notre Dame. If it's over 16 and a half, that is what I will say.
Yeah.
We got one here from Mark. He says, sorry, joining in late. Any way that Notre Dame will ever change the no official visit rule to committed players? Thanks for the content. Love the show, guys.
Mark, I mean, at this time, I haven't heard a change. Can it change? Maybe. I mean, I think it's possible, but it's something that the staff has kind of been on board with as of right now. But I mean, staffs are always going to change philosophies at some point, right? So could it change? Possibly. I haven't heard anything about it changing in the near future, though.
So he's talking about kids that are committed to Notre Dame taking official visits elsewhere.
Yes. Well, no. He's saying no visit rule to committed players as far as players that are committed to other schools coming to campus. Gotcha. So there was an issue with a cornerback that at the time was committed to Texas Tech. He wanted to come to Notre Dame on a visit, but they didn't want him to come because he was committed still to another school. They wanted, if he was going to come to campus because he was a flippable kid, that you would be an uncommitted player and be that type of thing. So
just to throw it out there, be devil's advocate, they offered Nova Sad. They're probably going to offer Minchie. They're both committed elsewhere. They're not going to allow them to come in on official visits then, right?
We will see if that rule changes, but in theory, you are correct. So we'll see.
Just put it out there. Okay.
You're not wrong, Vince. I thought of that the other day when I heard that they were pushing to try to get Nova Sad on campus at some point. So I was like, that's it's going to be an interesting conversation to have.
He's a Texas kid, isn't he? I mean,
yes, he is a Texas kid.
So that's a heck of a it's not an easy trip necessarily.
It's not an easy trip. I think John told us yesterday that he also doesn't have any official visits yet, so he would be making that trip on his own dime as well. So
all right. Well, hey, if you're saving 4 years worth of money for college, you could probably afford a trip up from Texas. I'm just saying.
You're not wrong.
That's the way I look at it anyway. All right. Sean Kane has a question here. Which has the highest percentage of happening? Buckner winning the Heisman, or Notre Dame going 12-0, or Notre Dame going 8-4?
12-0, I'd probably say.
Yes, I would too.
I'd say number 2. I don't think I think if Notre Dame was 8-4, it's a massive disappointment, right? Like I think that Notre Dame's going to be a better football team than I think a lot of the outside national media are going to give them credit for. Tyler Buckner winning the Heisman is an interesting one. I would just lean more towards Tyler Buckner in year 2 as a starter being a Heisman contending type of dual threat signal caller. So I would say Notre Dame going 12-0 would be my bet on the 3.
I would agree with that. I would say my order would be 2-1-3. I think that if Notre Dame goes 12-0, I think, the whole best player, best team kind of thing, like he's going to get Heisman talk if they're 12-0. I think he just will, because if they're 12-0, a lot of it has to do with him. But 8-4, man, that's such a low probability in my mind, because I have a hard time finding 4 teams they're going to lose to. That's my biggest issue. Yeah. So, yeah, I agree with you. It's definitely 12-0. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's the higher percentage.
It would. I mean, I would be just sad every single day if Notre Dame was 8-4. I don't think anybody on this site wants to see Sad Ryan. They haven't seen Sad Ryan yet. So
no, we haven't. We have not seen Sad Ryan. That would be bad. Yeah. They've seen Sad Vince before after the Cincinnati game last year, and then after the game.
I was at that Cincinnati game, so you could have seen Sad Ryan on campus on that one. But yeah.
That was a rough show. I think the show started. I was like, it was bad.
It was bad. Cincinnati jumped up to a nice lead, and then Notre Dame came roaring back. I was like, they're going to pull it out in the end. And then that stupid seam route to Leonard Taylor or whatever. Just like, oh, great. Okay.
Bad.
Yep.
All right. Well, Ryan, I think that is going to do it for our mailbag this afternoon. Thanks for joining me on a random Wednesday. Much appreciated. Make sure that you like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share it with your friends, give us a 5-star review. And also later on tonight, 6 o'clock, Sean Stiers and I will be on the IB Nation Sports Talk show. 6 o'clock sharp. We are going to talk about a myriad of things, but one of the things we're going to talk about is the Bill Polian wrote a book, and he outlines 11 criteria for a successful head coach and what he looks for when he's hiring a head coach. And we are going to apply that to Marcus Freeman, and we're going to talk about all 11 criteria. Sean wrote a great article about it. It's over on irishbreakdown.com. Make sure you go check it out. But we're going to talk about that on tonight's show. So that one should be a lot of fun. And then we've got some other things mixed in there, some grilling questions and some different stuff. So we're always all over the board with the IB Nation Sports Talk show. So make sure you check us out tonight at 6 o'clock. So come join us for that. Of course, our buddy Mace, he always gets us out of here right, and I love it. So join the message board, hit the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, leave a 5-star review, visit the IB store for some Gap Closers merch, and as always, go Irish.